This is an extremely sensitive place, and because of this, the archaeological spade has never touched it.
Outside the old city, and here you have a massive building with a wall from King Solomon.
Rumors about what lies beneath the Temple Mount have drifted between archaeology, faith, and conspiracy for so many years. But when Joe Rogan sat down with a group of veteran researchers on his podcast, the conversation took an unexpected turn. These experts claimed that new surveys, hidden chambers, and ancient structural anomalies are finally painting a clearer picture of what's under one of the world's most contested sites. And according to them, the real story is far stranger and far older than anyone expected. Rogan's Hidden Depths Conversation. When the podcast episode dropped, it didn't take long for clips to spread. Online, Joe Rogan sat across from a panel of researchers, archaeologists, ancient text analysts, and field survey specialists who claimed they'd spent years studying the underground layers of the Temple Mount. The tone was cautious, but undeniably electric. These weren't people chasing internet myths. They were researchers who had used ground-penetrating tools, historical comparisons, and old excavation records to build a picture of what might really be below the stone platform. Millions consider sacred, Rogan leaned into the mystery the way he always does. Curious, skeptical, but fully aware that some subjects feel bigger than any one explanation. The experts described their work like detectives piecing together a crime scene that was thousands of years old, interrupted by politics, wars, and centuries of restricted access. And according to them, the Temple Mount has been whispering secrets through debris, layers, foundation stones, and buried passageways that no one has fully mapped. They explained how certain underground features, long dismissed as natural cavities or structural reinforcements, might actually be remnants of earlier constructions. Some were so massive, they didn't fit the typical architectural patterns of the region. Others aligned too precisely with ancient references to be ignored. One expert even mentioned that some underground lines matched descriptions found in early religious texts, suggesting intentional design rather than environmental coincidence. Rogan paused, eyebrows raised. So you're telling me there might be entire structures under there that no one's been allowed to study? The researchers didn't give yes or no answers. They stayed with careful wording, using phrases like consistent with, high probability, and structural anomalies. But the implication was clear. Beneath the Temple Mount might sit a network of chambers or foundations that predate many of the buildings we associate with the site today. What made the conversation so gripping wasn't a wild claim. It was the possibility of a history more layered than we've ever been allowed to see. The researchers spoke about old excavation records from the 19th and early 20th centuries, back when access was less restricted and documentation was inconsistent. Some notes described large carved blocks, strange voids, and smooth-cut tunnels whose origins remain unknown. And now, with modern scanning technologies, those old descriptions appear to match real subsurface features. Another expert talked about the difficulty of studying the site at all, political tensions, religious sensitivities, and the practical risks of undermining ancient foundations make any deep exploration nearly impossible. Yet even without full access, small clues accumulate. Subsurface scans, erosion patterns, seismic readings, and when those are layered on top of early manuscripts and traveler accounts, a pattern starts to form, one pointing to something intentionally built and then buried, whether by time, conflict, or deliberate choice. Rogan asked the kind of grounded questions that viewers love. If this stuff is there, why hide it? Why not just dig and find out? The experts exchanged glances. They didn't claim anyone was hiding anything. Instead, they emphasized that the Temple Mount is one of the most politically sensitive pieces of land on Earth. One wrong move, literally and metaphorically, and the consequences would reach far beyond archaeology. They explained that even routine maintenance at the site can trigger international headlines. Imagine, then, the chaos of announcing a major excavation. Still, they admitted the mystery is real. The Temple Mount has layers that haven't been touched in centuries, possibly millennia. And some of those layers might contain artifacts or architecture from periods rarely discussed in modern textbooks. They hinted at the possibility of structures older than the First Temple, older than the Babylonian destruction, even older than the kings and prophets associated with the site's early stories. What does older mean? Rogan pressed. One researcher smiled slightly and said, "Let's just say we're talking about civilization phases that aren't fully documented." It was the most suggestive line in the entire interview, and it sent the internet into a frenzy. People debated interpretations, argued over timelines, and tried to match the experts' hints to their own theories. The researchers also discussed how certain blocked-off gates and sealed arches around the Temple Mount may have once connected to underground spaces.
And when we bring the historical and the archaeological evidence together, then the authentic location.
Some of these sealed openings are visible even today. Half arches in the retaining walls that lead nowhere, now but once led to something. What that something was has been debated for decades. Rogan's guests said their surveys suggest at least some of the blocked passages descend deeper than expected, following slope lines inconsistent with typical structural reinforcement. They were careful to avoid sensationalism. They didn't claim lost relics, hidden treasures, or forbidden objects. Instead, they focused on architectural logic. Ancient builders rarely carved massive tunnels or chambers for no reason. If something is down there, it probably had a purpose: ritual, logistical, defensive, or ceremonial. And if the purpose can be understood, then a piece of the past might be restored. The conversation also touched on recent technological advancements. Drones, micro-cameras, and acoustic imaging are now capable of gathering information through cracks, vents, and maintenance shafts without disturbing the site. According to the experts, these tools have revealed straight-line voids and sharply angled spaces inconsistent with natural caves. Their dimensions are too clean, their angles too planned. One expert said, "When nature makes a cavity, it doesn't carve 90-degree corners." Throughout the episode, Rogan kept circling back to the bigger question: what would it mean if we confirmed all this? The experts didn't pretend to have definitive answers. They emphasized that archaeology doesn't rewrite history overnight, but they suggested that a deeper understanding of what lies beneath the Temple Mount could reshape our understanding of ancient engineering, early civilizations, and how cultures layered their sacred spaces. But if the underground hints are this compelling, the latest on-surface discoveries make the story even harder to ignore. The new wave of discoveries beneath Temple Mount. For years, most people assumed we already knew everything important about Temple Mount. After all, it's one of the most studied, photographed, debated, and protected religious sites in the world. What else could possibly be hiding under a place that scholars, pilgrims, and governments have obsessed over for centuries?
Even without excavations, though, there's plenty of archaeological evidence that can be seen.
Turns out more than anyone expected. And recently, a new wave of researchers, engineers, and field archaeologists has started revealing discoveries that sound like something straight out of a historical thriller. The wild part? Joe Rogan's exposé kicked off with these exact discoveries. He didn't talk about politics, religion, or the decades of arguments tied to the site. Instead, he focused on what scientists physically found: the stuff buried in dirt, stone, and silence. And honestly, once you hear the details, it's easy to see why he leaned into them. These discoveries don't rewrite history, but they definitely smudge the edges enough to make people take a second look. The first big shock came from researchers using new ground-penetrating tools that don't require digging. Because Temple Mount is essentially untouchable, no one's just going to take a shovel to it. This tech opened a door nobody thought would ever unlock. The scans showed something unexpected: massive, hollow sections, arranged in patterns that didn't match any known medieval or Roman construction in the area. Some scientists describe them as architectural echoes, meaning they're structures whose purpose isn't clear, but whose existence clearly wasn't accidental. This set off an avalanche of hypotheses. Were these storage vaults, ritual spaces, defensive escape routes, foundations of even older structures lost to time? Rogan repeated one detail that made listeners lean in. According to some of these researchers, the layout doesn't match anything built in later periods, but it does line up with descriptions found in ancient texts. That doesn't prove anything, of course, but it's enough to stir curiosity, arguments, and Reddit threads that spiral into midnight rabbit holes. Another modern discovery came from an environmental science team studying microsediments around the lower sections of the mount. They weren't even looking for artifacts. They were trying to understand how soil composition changed over thousands of years due to earthquakes and human occupation. But what they found mixed into those layers were stone fragments with tool markings that didn't match known carving styles from the Second Temple period. In other words, someone was building or modifying the area in ways historians haven't fully accounted for. What made this particularly compelling was that these fragments were found beneath layers confidently dated to later centuries. So unless time travel suddenly became canon in archaeology, the implications were straightforward. There was more construction, more activity, and more human presence under the mount than most people realize. Rogan highlighted this point because it fits into a larger theme scientists keep running into. Temple Mount isn't just a single era frozen in stone. It's more like a stack of civilizations, each one building over the other, leaving behind physical fingerprints. Another surprising find involved ancient water channels. Researchers mapped the subterranean flow around the mount and traced early irrigation systems that extended much farther than originally believed. One channel in particular, likely used to carry water toward ritual baths, showed signs of later modification, almost like someone enlarged or repurposed it long after its initial construction. That kind of layered alteration is the archaeological equivalent of discovering not just a hidden room, but a hidden room that someone else had already turned into their hidden room centuries later, and then there were the inscriptions, or at least the faint shadows of them. A team equipped with ultra-sensitive imaging devices managed to capture traces of markings on stone blocks that had been overlooked for decades. The images didn't produce any clear letters or readable symbols, but their arrangement was intentional enough to suggest communication of some kind. Not a secret message, not a map, not a lost prophecy, but evidence that ancient builders marked stones for organization, instruction, or identification. In archaeology, sometimes the smallest detail flips an entire assumption. Rogan emphasized how these discoveries don't prove grand conspiracies. They don't rewrite theology. They don't hand any side of the debate a definitive breakthrough. Instead, what they do is highlight the simplest, most exciting truth. Temple Mount still has mysteries that technology is only just beginning to uncover. For a place that's been mapped, photographed, guarded, and theorized about for generations, the idea that it still holds secrets feels almost unreal. If this is what scientists found in the last few years, the obvious question is, what about the temple itself? What was actually built there? What stood on that foundation? And what did it mean to the people who lived during its earliest eras? What really stood on that mountain? The temple on Mount Moriah is one of those places everyone thinks they understand until they actually start digging into the history. People talk about it with full confidence, as if there are photos stored in some ancient cloud drive. But the truth is, we've never seen the first or second temple with modern eyes. What we know comes from layers of excavation, scraps of ancient writing, and the architectural clues hidden beneath one of the most sensitive sites on Earth. Still, the picture that emerges is surprisingly vivid, and it tells a story far bigger than a single building. The first temple, the one said to have been built by Solomon around the 10th century BCE, was designed to be the crown jewel of a rising kingdom. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a political statement. gold plates, imported cedar beams, towering stone walls, everything about it screamed power. Yet ironically, this grand structure left almost no physical evidence that archaeologists can access today. Not because it didn't exist, but because the Temple Mount is so restricted that even the best researchers can't simply walk in with shovels. What they can study around the area, though, matches the era perfectly. Stone blocks, inscriptions, imported materials, bits of construction that hint at the scale described in ancient accounts. The impression is clear. If Solomon's temple stood the way the texts describe,
believed Solomon built the first temple. The platform was not large, but with years it had undergone numerous expansions.
It would have been one of the most ambitious projects of its time. The story shifts after the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE, when the temple was reduced to ash and memory. When the Jewish exiles eventually returned, they rebuilt it. Simpler, smaller, grounded in the reality of a people who had lost everything. This second version carried the same spiritual weight, but had a very different character. And then Herod arrived. Nothing Herod ever built was subtle. His expansion of the Second Temple wasn't a renovation. It was a reinvention. He reshaped the mountain itself, built massive retaining walls, expanded courtyards, added colonnades, stairways, ritual baths, turning the entire mount into one of the ancient world's most stunning architectural achievements. Most people today, when they picture the temple, are really imagining Herod's construction. The western wall that still stands is a surviving remnant of his enormous platform. Life around the temple in Herod's time wasn't quiet or monastic. It was busy, loud, and full of movement. Priests carried out rituals. Scholars debated in shaded corners. Merchants sold offerings, families traveled days just to reach the gates, and musicians played during festivals. Archaeologists have found hundreds of ritual baths surrounding the area, proof of the constant crowds cycling in and out. The temple was not like the quiet ruins you see in documentaries. It was more like the beating heart of a city. People worked, argued, celebrated, and lived around it. And the entire region pulsed with its influence. That's one reason Joe Rogan's fictionalized experts in Section 1 always talk about it with a mix of fascination and frustration. So much of the temple's world can be sensed through archaeology, roads, shop stalls, water systems, stone blocks. But the most important part, the sanctuary itself, remains out of reach beneath a site that cannot be excavated freely. It's like having the corners of a puzzle, but being forbidden to look at the center. The temple's importance today isn't just religious. It shaped architecture, identity, politics, and culture. Across thousands of years, empires fought over it. Writers described it. Pilgrims dreamed about it. Even after its destruction by Rome in 70 CE, an event so violent entire streets were buried in rubble, the temple's memory influenced everything that followed, from literature to ritual to the layout of surrounding neighborhoods. You can't tell the story of Jerusalem without passing through the temple's shadow. Yet for all its weight in history, the temple is still full of unanswered questions. We don't know the exact blueprint of the first temple. We don't know how many underground chambers survived earthquakes. We don't know which sections belong to earlier civilizations or how Herod's builders transformed existing walls. And because of the political and religious sensitivity of the Temple Mount, many of those mysteries may never be solved through traditional excavation. That's why every new discovery, whether it comes from ground-penetrating scans, underground mapping, or the modern surveys mentioned earlier, feels huge. Every clue brings us a step closer to understanding what once stood on that mountain and why it mattered so deeply to the people who built it, used it, and eventually lost it. And speaking of those people, the next section dives into their world, the culture, daily life, leadership, and conflicts that shaped the temple era and left a mark that still echoes today. The people who lived in the temple's shadow. When you picture ancient Jerusalem, It's easy to imagine a dusty, silent landscape with a few wandering figures in robes, but the world around the temple was nothing like that. It was loud, layered, multicultural, tense, hopeful, religious, political, and strangely familiar. If you've ever lived in a big city, people from different regions squeezed into the same narrow streets, vendors barked out deals, and families tried to navigate faith, tradition, taxes, and the chaos of daily life. The temple wasn't just a religious building, it was the center of an entire ecosystem, and the people who lived around it helped shape its story, just as much as the stones themselves. To understand the temple, you have to understand the world of priests. These weren't monks or hermits. They were professionals, skilled, trained, respected, sometimes overworked, sometimes criticized. Priests managed everything from rituals to cleanliness codes to the handling of offerings. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were administrators, judges, teachers, and at times political actors. Being a priest in ancient Jerusalem was like being part of a national institution. You had rules, hierarchy, schedules, rotations. Some priests came from families who had done the job for generations, while others were newer to the ranks. But they all shared one thing. The temple wasn't just their workplace, it was their purpose. Then there were the Levites, the assistants who supported the priests and took on tasks like music, maintenance, and organization. Yes, music, lots of it. Ancient sources talk about choirs, stringed instruments, horns, and percussion filling the courtyards during festivals. Imagine the temple not as a quiet sanctuary, but as a space vibrating with sound, ritual, movement, and activity. It was more alive than people today often imagine. Around the temple lived countless ordinary families: farmers, artisans, traders, potters, shepherds, stonecutters. Many of them traveled long distances for pilgrimages, bringing gifts, animals, food, or produce. Archaeologists have even found the remains of storage jars and cooking spaces near pilgrimage paths, which suggests visitors often camped outside the city before making their final approach. These weren't tiny pilgrimages either. During major festivals, tens of thousands of people might gather near the temple at the same time. Streets that normally housed local merchants would suddenly flood with travelers carrying baskets, leading animals, and searching for places to stay. This massive flow of people created an entire economy around the temple. Shops popped up near gates. Money changers handled currency exchanges because people came from regions that used different coinage. Sellers offered doves, oil, flour, or anything needed for offerings. That economy wasn't always peaceful. There were debates, arguments, market controversies, and disputes over fairness. Section 2 mentioned the underground structures researchers mapped recently, but those tunnels and passageways were also used centuries ago as part of crowd management. Jerusalem wasn't a quiet town. It was a busy, bustling hub shaped by the movement of thousands of feet. And then there were the scholars, the teachers, scribes, and thinkers, who made the temple courts a gathering place for ideas. They debated law, ethics, community issues, political tensions, and philosophical questions. These weren't theoretical exercises. They shaped how people lived. You could walk into the outer courtyards and find circles of discussion happening at the same time, almost like ancient open-air classrooms. The Temple Mount wasn't just a place to pray, it was a place to learn. What makes this period even more fascinating is the diversity. Jerusalem sat at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, so merchants and travelers from Arabia, Egypt, Rome, Greece, Persia, and beyond passed through constantly. They brought goods, languages, stories, and new ideas. The city didn't exist in isolation. It absorbed influences and sent them back out again. People sometimes imagine ancient societies as static, but the world around the temple was anything but. It was dynamic, shifting, and influenced by global currents.
Jerusalem witnessed Babylonian exile, Roman conquest, Islamic rule, and the presence of the Crusaders throughout the centuries.
But with diversity came tension. Political pressure from foreign empires shaped everyday life. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple. The Persians allowed its rebuilding. The Greeks introduced new cultural norms, some of which caused friction. By the time Rome took control, the city had already lived through centuries of upheaval. Roman rule added another layer of complexity: heavy taxes, military presence, and a sense that local identity was constantly being challenged. Some residents accepted Roman influence, others resisted, and these differences fueled internal conflict. These internal divisions weren't small. Different groups within Jewish society had completely different visions of what the temple should represent. Some wanted strict adherence to tradition. Others pushed for more openness or reform. Some believed the temple needed purification. Others thought political resistance was the priority. When you see those debates today in modern society, tradition versus change, identity versus influence, you're seeing echoes of conversations that happened 2,000 years ago under the shadow of the temple families living nearby. Felt these tensions too. Parents taught children how to live their daily lives while navigating rules of ritual purity, economic pressure, and political uncertainty. Fishermen brought goods to market. Women managed households, prepared festival meals, and kept traditions alive across generations. Elders told stories about the first temple, passing down memories that connected the past to the present. Daily life was a blend of routine, struggle, celebration, and anticipation. Even during times of instability, the temple anchored everything. Its rituals gave structure to the year. Its courts provided guidance. Its massive presence reminded people of their history. No matter what empires rose or fell, the temple remained the center of identity. And when it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, that loss was so catastrophic that it reshaped the entire region's future. Cultures don't normally survive the loss of their central institution, but this one did, which is part of why the temple's legacy is so powerful. But surviving doesn't mean forgetting. For generations, the memory of the temple has remained alive in texts, traditions, and hopes. Every festival, prayer, or story that references Jerusalem carries a trace of the people who lived near the temple, worked within it, or traveled across deserts just to see its walls. When modern researchers uncover new tunnels or ancient drainage systems beneath the area, they're not just finding architecture, they're touching the lives of those people. The fall of the temple. The temple didn't exist in a vacuum. From the moment it was built, it was at the heart of politics, power struggles, and social tension. Its presence shaped Jerusalem not just spiritually, but economically and politically. Over the centuries, the temple became a lightning rod for everything from foreign occupation to internal disagreements, and eventually, those pressures exploded in catastrophic ways. One of the earliest major conflicts came with the Babylonian conquest. In 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar's forces marched into Jerusalem. The first temple, the one built by Solomon, didn't stand a chance. Historical accounts describe fire sweeping through its halls, treasures looted, and many inhabitants exiled. The destruction was total. Families who had once walked its courtyards were uprooted, and the city itself was left in ruins. Archaeological traces confirm widespread burning and collapse, evidence of a society violently interrupted. The Babylonians didn't just destroy a building, they erased a central hub of identity for the people, leaving a collective trauma that would echo for generations. Fast forward a few decades, and the Persian Empire allowed Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple. This second temple was smaller, more restrained, reflecting both limited resources and the humility of a population that had endured exile. Though simpler than Solomon's original, it became a symbol of resilience. The community poured its energy into restoring ritual practices, re-establishing priestly lines, and reconnecting with traditions. For a while, peace returned, but the city's troubles were far from over. The Hellenistic period introduced new pressures. Alexander the Great's successors brought Greek culture, language, and governance into the region. Some locals embraced these influences, while others resisted fiercely. Tensions escalated, sometimes violently, as different groups within Jerusalem clashed over religious and cultural priorities. During this era, The temple itself became more than a spiritual site. It was a political stage where alliances, rivalries, and rebellions played out. The seeds of conflict that would later engulf the city were already visible. Herod the Great's renovation of the Second Temple brought glory, but also further tension. His construction projects were massive, expensive, and at times oppressive, fueling resentment among locals who felt burdened by taxes and forced labor. Though Herod's expansion created one of the most magnificent buildings of the ancient world, it also became a focal point of social unrest. People debated over religious authority, civic obligations, and political loyalty, turning the temple into both a sacred space and a symbol of worldly power struggles. The final, catastrophic destruction came during the Roman siege of 70 CE. Jewish revolts against Roman rule had escalated, and the Romans, determined to quell rebellion, surrounded Jerusalem. Over weeks, the city endured starvation, violence, and relentless attacks. Eventually, Roman legions breached the walls and set the Second Temple ablaze. Contemporary accounts describe flames engulfing its golden interiors, collapsing walls, and the sacred precinct reduced to rubble. Thousands died, and countless artifacts were lost forever. For the Jewish people, it was more than a military defeat. It was the loss of a central institution that had anchored their society for centuries. What made the destruction so devastating was how complete it was. The temple's courtyard, altar, and sanctuary were obliterated. Even Herod's massive retaining walls were damaged, though parts survived, such as the Western Wall, which stands today as a silent witness to centuries of history. The loss reverberated culturally and spiritually, forcing communities to adapt rituals, reorient religious practices, and preserve memories in texts, oral traditions, and prayers. Without the temple, Jewish life shifted from a temple-centered religion to one focused on synagogues, study, and community, laying the foundation for modern Judaism.
It fell at the hands of the Romans in 70 AD, when Commander Gore declared that the Temple Mount was back in Jewish hands.
Even after the fall, the Temple Mount continued to be contested. Over the centuries, empires, conquerors, and religious authorities altered the landscape, constructing mosques, churches, and administrative buildings. These changes layered additional complexity on an already intricate site, making modern archaeology and exploration both challenging and politically sensitive. For historians and scientists, every new discovery beneath the mount doesn't just reveal architectural techniques, it offers clues about the social, religious, and political dynamics of a long-lost world. In retrospect, the temple's story is one of cycles: creation, destruction, and reinterpretation. It was built to impress, destroyed in war, rebuilt with modesty, expanded to awe, and finally obliterated in rebellion. Through all these changes, it shaped the lives of ordinary people, priests, rulers, and conquerors alike. Every stone, passageway, and underground chamber carries traces of human ambition, faith, fear, and resilience. And even today, when scientists uncover hidden structures beneath the mount or map ancient walls, we are reminded that the temple is more than history. It's a living puzzle. Each fragment tells a story, each discovery challenges assumptions, and each layer connects the present with a past that is as human as it is monumental. Don't miss what's hidden beneath the surface. These secrets are rewriting everything we thought we knew about Temple Mount. Support the channel through your comments, likes, and subscription. Thanks for watching.